In late 1943, the front lines in Ukraine were the product of a year of continuous retreat and counterattack. After the defeats at Kursk and in the Battle of the Dnieper, German Army Group South had withdrawn to the right bank of the Dnieper, still holding much of right bank Ukraine, but losing the industrial regions of the Donbass and the major river crossings east of Kiev. The Red Army, in turn, had expended large forces in successive offensives from August to November, gaining ground, but at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties in the Dnieper campaign as a whole. On November 6, 1943, the First Ukrainian Front, under General Nikolai Vatutin, captured Kiev, creating a large bridgehead on the western bank of the river. From this salient, Soviet troops pressed west and southwest toward Zhitomir, Korosten, and Fastov, threatening German rail lines that linked Army Group South to Poland and the Reich. For German planners, the loss of Kiev and the Soviet presence west of the Dnieper meant that their defensive concept, built around the so-called Eastern Wall, had already been compromised before it was fully organized. In November and early December, Erich von Manstein attempted to restore the situation with counterattacks by 4th Panzer Army and elements of 1st Panzer Army. These operations retook Zhitomir temporarily and created a more continuous front, but they also drew on armoured reserves that were limited and difficult to replace. The German command wanted to shorten the line in Ukraine and pull back to more defensible positions, yet Adolf Hitler repeatedly ordered his generals to stand fast and to hold the remaining Ukrainian territories, including key agricultural and railway regions around Zhitomir and Berdichev. For the Soviet leadership, the Kiev bridgehead opened the possibility of a winter campaign that could carry their forces across much of right-bank Ukraine. The Stavka Directive that created the Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive envisaged a sequence of operations beginning with a blow by 1st Ukrainian Front against the northern wing of Army Group South. These troops included 63 rifle divisions, 3 cavalry divisions, 6 tank corps, and 2 mechanized corps, as well as the 1st Czechoslovak Independent Brigade fighting alongside the Red Army. Opposite them, the German 4th Panzer Army, responsible for the sector west and southwest of Kiev, reported a ration strength of about 358,000 men on 20 December 1943. Its armoured park comprised roughly 347 operational tanks, 116 operational assault guns, and about 155 self-propelled anti-tank and artillery pieces, with almost as many vehicles again in repair. Further south, 1st Panzer Army would reach a strength of about 260,000 men by late January 1944, and was already being drawn northward as a mobile reserve. Civilians in right-bank Ukraine had already experienced 2 years of German occupation, marked by forced labour, requisitions, and the destruction of Jewish communities. As the front moved back and forth in late 1943, many villages around Zhitomir and Berdichev saw successive arrivals of German, Soviet, and sometimes collaborationist formations. Each change of control could bring new demands for food and shelter, new arrests, and the risk of being accused of aiding the previous occupier. For local communities, the coming Soviet offensive promised the end of German rule, but also another passage of large armies in winter conditions. Public sentiment in the belligerent states reflected these contrasting pressures. In the Soviet Union, the recovery of Kiev and the prospect of liberating the rest of Ukraine were presented as milestones toward the restoration of 1941 borders and as evidence that the Red Army could now conduct large-scale winter offensives. In Germany, official propaganda emphasized holding the fortress of the Eastern Front and protecting Europe from a Soviet advance, while internally the army leadership worried about the possibility that a Soviet breakthrough west of Kiev could cut the communications of Army Group South. Within this framework, the Zhitomir Berdichev offensive would begin not as an isolated battle, but as the opening phase of a broad winter campaign. Its military purpose was to fracture the German front in right bank Ukraine. Its political and economic implications involved the control of territory, population, and resources. Its human cost would later raise questions about how such operations were remembered compared with the more famous summer victories of 1944. Before dawn on the 24th of December, 1943, the positions of the First Ukrainian Front along the western bank of the Dnieper were already aligned for an offensive. Infantry formations had been brought forward into narrow assault sectors, with artillery grouped behind them in dense batteries. Engineer units worked through the night marking lanes through minefields and frozen ground, while reconnaissance detachments probed German outposts to identify firing points and reserve positions. Orders circulated down the chain of command from front headquarters to army, corps, division and regiment, specifying start times, objectives for the first day, and the lines along which tank armies would be committed after a breach had been opened. On the Soviet side, the basic structure of the opening phase placed combined arms armies in the first echelon, and armoured formations in the 2nd Rifle Divisions were tasked with breaking into the German defensive system on a frontage of only a few kilometres per division, supported by artillery densities that reached more than 100 guns and mortars per kilometre on priority sectors. Assault battalions composed of sappers, submachine gunners, and flamethrower teams were to lead the way into forward trenches, followed by the main rifle regiments, and then supporting tanks as soon as ground conditions allowed. Air support from 2nd Air Army was assigned to attack identified strongpoints and road junctions behind the front. For the German 4th Panzer Army, the days before the offensive were marked by conflicting signals. Frontline reports described increased Soviet patrol activity and the movement of artillery at night, but winter weather and limitations in aerial reconnaissance made it difficult to judge the scale of the preparations. Corps and divisional staffs attempted to reconstruct Soviet intentions from intercepted radio traffic and prisoner interrogations, while at the same time coping with shortages of fuel and ammunition that constrained their own freedom to maneuver. Commanders requested permission to shorten the line and pull back to more compact positions, yet higher headquarters insisted on holding key localities and railway nodes west of Kiev. In the early morning hours, as Orthodox and Catholic communities in the region approached different winter holidays, the front entered another phase of transition. German and Hungarian units occupying villages around Zhitomir and Berdichev maintained routine sentry duty and patrol schedules, aware of increased Soviet activity, but not yet certain whether a major attack was imminent or whether the Red Army would postpone operations until later in the winter. Local civilians were caught between these forces, working in fields, workshops, and transport columns under occupation authorities, while also maintaining contact with Soviet partisans or underground networks where possible. Shortly after first light on the 24th of December, Soviet artillery opened concentrated fire along selected sectors of the German line. The preparation lasted for a limited period to conserve ammunition, focusing on trench lines, command posts, artillery batteries, and suspected reserve assembly areas. Communication lines were cut, observation posts targeted, and road junctions shelled to hinder the movement of German reserves. The noise and disruption of the bombardment provided a first indication to German frontline units that the anticipated offensive had begun. As the shelling lifted, rifle units advanced from their start lines. In several sectors, they moved across snow-covered fields and partially frozen ground toward German positions that had been strengthened during the previous month. The first hours of combat brought a mixture of outcomes. In some places, Soviet assault groups succeeded in overrunning forward trenches and seizing small footholds in the main defensive belt. In others, they encountered intact machine gun nests and anti-tank guns that had survived the bombardment and inflicted losses on the attacking battalions. Communications from company and battalion commanders back to division headquarters reported both local successes and areas where the attack had stalled in front of wire and minefields. German company and battalion commanders reacted by calling down defensive fire from their own artillery and mortars and by committing local reserves, platoon and company-sized counterattack groups assembled from infantry, engineers and available armoured vehicles. Because the front ran through a mixture of open country and settlements, immediate counterattacks often centred on farmsteads, small woods or road crossings that had tactical value. In many cases, they succeeded in retaking portions of the forward line or stabilising the situation until higher-level reserves could be moved. In other sectors, they were checked by continued Soviet artillery fire and by the arrival of supporting tanks and self-propelled guns. On both sides, the command structures had to interpret rapidly changing information. Vatutin and his staff monitored reports from the leading armies, trying to determine where the first echelon had broken through and where additional artillery or air support was needed to overcome resistance. The plan envisaged committing tank armies into sectors where rifle divisions had achieved at least a partial penetration, allowing armoured formations to pass through and drive toward operational objectives beyond the immediate battlefield. In contrast, the staff of 4th Panzer Army sought to identify the main axes of the Soviet thrust and to decide where to commit scarce armoured reserves to block or slow any deep advances. For civilians in villages and towns along the line of contact, the opening day of the offensive meant renewed shelling, the movement of columns of troops through streets and fields, and the uncertainty of which side would be in control by nightfall. Many inhabitants had already experienced evacuation or deportation earlier in the war. Others had remained in place under occupation. As fighting moved closer, some attempted to shelter in cellars and improvised dugouts, while others were drawn into tasks such as transporting wounded, constructing fieldworks, or providing quarters for passing units. By the evening of the 24th of December, the front around Zhitomir and Berdichev no longer corresponded exactly to the lines marked on maps the previous day. Soviet forces had achieved limited penetrations at several points, creating salients in the German defensive system. German staffs had begun to register the weight of the assault and to redirect reserves accordingly. The first phase of the Zhitomir Berdichev operation was underway, setting the stage for deeper thrusts and the commitment of larger armoured formations in the days that followed. The Zhitomir Berdichev offensive was conceived within a broader winter strategy that Soviet planners called the Dnieper-Carpathian Campaign. At the strategic level, the Stavka aimed to exploit the Kiev bridgehead to turn the northern flank of Army Group South, break its front in right-bank Ukraine, and create conditions for further operations toward the southern Bug and the Carpathians. The first Ukrainian front was assigned the role of striking first, opening a corridor through which subsequent fronts could advance into western Ukraine and toward the borders of pre-war Poland and Romania. For First Ukrainian Front, Vatutin and his staff translated these intentions into a more specific operational design. The front was to defeat the German 4th Panzer Army, push its remnants west and southwest, and prevent any renewed attempt to retake Kiev. The planned depth of advance ranged from several dozen to nearly 200 kilometers, with intermediate objectives including Zhitomir, Berdichev, Kazatin, and Vinnytsia. Control of these rail and road hubs would allow the Red Army to reorganize its logistics, bring forward artillery and tank formations, and threaten the main routes connecting Army Group South with the Reich. The front structure reflected Soviet deep operations doctrine. Combined arms armies formed the first echelon, tasked with breaching German defences on selected sectors. The second echelon consisted of tank and mechanized armies designated for exploitation once rifle formations had opened corridors wide enough for large armoured groupings. Supporting this design, air forces were to provide interdiction against German reserves and destroy transport nodes behind the front. Staff work in November and December focused on aligning axes of advance, coordinating artillery plans, and determining where and when to commit armoured reserves. On the German side, strategic goals were defined by a combination of military and political constraints. Manstein's Army Group South sought to preserve a continuous front in Ukraine, maintain control of key economic regions, and avoid encirclements that could destroy large formations. In principle, he favored flexible defense, trading ground for time, and conducting counterattacks with mobile reserves. However, Hitler insisted on holding the right bank of the Dnieper as long as possible, viewing the loss of further Ukrainian territory as politically and economically unacceptable. This tension shaped the planning for the winter period. The immediate objective for 4th Panzer Army was to stabilize the line west and southwest of Kiev, hold transport hubs like Zhitomir and Berdichev, and protect the lateral railways that supplied German forces further south. Defensive planning emphasized a forward belt of field fortifications, supported by local reserves and armored groups able to counterattack any Soviet penetration. At the same time, the army had to prepare contingency plans for withdrawing to successive positions if forced by Soviet breakthroughs, even though such withdrawals might conflict with orders from higher authority. Logistics played a central role in both sides' calculations. Soviet planners had to move large quantities of ammunition, fuel and food across the Dnieper and through the Kiev bridgehead before the ground froze completely. Rail lines leading to Kiev were repaired or expanded, and engineer units worked to improve roads and build depots close to the front. Given the strain of previous offensives, stockpiling had limits. Not all armies could receive full ammunition loads, and many formations entered the operation with vehicles and artillery already worn from earlier campaigns. The planning therefore assumed a relatively short but intense offensive phase, followed by a pause for regrouping. For the Germans, supply planning faced the cumulative effects of retreat and bombing. Rail lines in Ukraine had to be converted from Soviet to German gauge and then defended against partisan attacks. Winter conditions increased fuel consumption for vehicles and made road movement slow, particularly for armoured units that depended on motorised columns for ammunition and spare parts. As a result, the capacity to shift reserves rapidly along the front was constrained, even before the Soviet offensive began. Intelligence estimates on both sides involved uncertainties. Soviet staff officers used aerial reconnaissance, ground patrols and partisan reports to map the German defensive system and identify concentrations of armour. They correctly assessed that the 4th Panzer Army's infantry divisions were thinly spread and that the northern flank of Army Group South was vulnerable. However, they underestimated the speed with which German command could redeploy formations from other sectors once the direction of the main blow became clear. German intelligence observed Soviet troop build-up in the Kiev bridgehead and detected new artillery positions, but assessments differed on whether the Red Army would launch a major winter offensive or limit itself to local attacks. Weather-hampered aerial observation and the experience of earlier Soviet operations led some staff officers to assume that the Red Army might need more time to replenish losses from the Battle of the Dnieper. This contributed to a degree of complacency in some sectors of the front. Finally, considerations of public and troop morale influenced planning. Soviet leadership was aware of the symbolic value of liberating further regions of Ukraine during the winter of 1943 to 1944. Propaganda organs were prepared to present the offensive as a continuation of the victories at Kursk and Kiev, emphasizing the restoration of pre-war territories. At the same time, commanders in the field had to manage the expectations attached to rapid success with the realities of winter operations and the state of their forces. German authorities, for their part, sought to reassure the home front that the eastern line remained firm, presenting forthcoming battles as necessary measures to shield Central Europe. This divergence between political messaging and military risk formed part of the strategic background against which the Zhitomir Berdichev operation was planned. In the days immediately after the 24th of December, the front west and southwest of Kiev became a series of local engagements that gradually merged into a larger movement. Along a stretch of more than 300 kilometers, armies of the First Ukrainian Front pressed against the sectors held by German 4th Panzer Army and the adjoining formations of the 1st Panzer Army. Each sector developed its own tempo, depending on terrain, the the density of German defences, and the availability of Soviet reserves. North of Zhitomir, formations of the 1st Guards Army advanced against positions held by German 7th Army Corps. The Soviet plan here aimed to force the Germans away from the rail line running through Korostan and to outflank their positions further south. Early assaults captured a number of forward strongpoints in forested terrain, but progress remained limited where German infantry, supported by anti-tank guns and a few self-propelled batteries, held on to prepared positions on ridges and at road junctions. Reports from Soviet rifle divisions recorded gains of several kilometers per day in some sectors, while adjacent units moved only hundreds of meters under fire. Further south, 18th and 38th Armies attacked the approaches to Zhitomir and the road network leading toward Berdichev. Here, the terrain alternated between open fields and small settlements, with river valleys and wooded patches providing natural defensive lines. Soviet units advancing through snow and frozen ground encountered minefields and interlocking machine gun positions around villages that had been turned into strong points. In some cases, assault battalions entered these villages, house by house, supported by direct fire from field guns and the limited number of tanks that could be brought forward along icy roads. On the German side, divisional commanders received increasing numbers of reports that Soviet troops had broken into outer defensive belts and that local counterattacks were needed to restore the line. Mobile groups built around Panzer or Panzer Grenadier battalions were sent to threatened sectors, often moving at night to reduce exposure to Soviet aircraft. A Panzer battalion might be ordered to support infantry in retaking a lost village at first light, then withdraw to a new assembly area in anticipation of further Soviet pushes. Fuel shortages and mechanical wear imposed limits. Staff diaries from this period frequently recorded the number of operational tanks in single digits for some units after several days of continuous fighting. As the offensive continued, territorial changes became more visible. On some stretches of the front, Soviet maps marked advances of 20 to 30 kilometers by the end of December, cutting secondary roads and pushing German outposts away from key river crossings. In contrast, other sectors saw only minor shifts, with German positions bending but not breaking. This uneven pattern required continual adjustments. Soviet commanders shifted artillery and reserves towards sectors where breakthroughs seemed possible, while German corps moved their remaining armoured units to seal gaps they considered most dangerous. The impact on civilians was immediate. Villages that had been under German occupation for more than 2 years suddenly lay in the path of advancing or retreating units. Homes were requisitioned as command posts or aid stations. Barns and sheds became temporary shelters for troops and horses. Some inhabitants attempted to hide livestock and food, anticipating that both sides would demand supplies. Others tried to demonstrate loyalty to whichever side currently held the village, aware that accusations of collaboration or resistance could follow any change in control. In areas where front lines passed repeatedly over the same ground, families sometimes spent days in cellars while artillery fire and small arms combat continued above. Morale among soldiers reflected these conditions. Soviet infantrymen could see that the line was moving westward and that German positions, once considered fixed, were being abandoned or overrun. At the same time, they faced winter marches, limited rest, and the sight of casualties accumulating along narrow assault corridors. German troops understood that they were yielding ground in right-bank Ukraine, yet company and battalion commanders could still point to local successes where counterattacks restored segments of the line or destroyed Soviet tanks. For many frontline soldiers, the broader strategic picture remained abstract compared with the immediate task of holding a trench or taking a particular building. Weather and terrain shaped the character of these first engagements. Periods of frost alternated with thaws that turned roads into channels of mud and ice. River crossings required improvisation when ice was not thick enough to carry vehicles. Damaged bridges had to be repaired under fire by engineer units from both sides. These conditions slowed the movement of heavy artillery and supply columns, producing temporary shortages of ammunition and fuel at the front. As a result, some attacks went forward with reduced artillery preparation or limited armoured support, affecting their outcome and contributing to higher infantry losses. By the turn of the year, staff summaries on both sides began to register the human cost of the opening phase. Soviet daily reports listed rifle divisions reduced to a fraction of their authorized strength after repeated assaults. German returns showed infantry regiments and battalions dropping below half of their original numbers, with companies of fewer than 80 men, where tables of organization provided for more than 150. These figures did not yet represent the full balance sheet of the operation, but they foreshadowed the scale of casualties that the Zhitomir Berdichev offensive would entail as the fighting shifted from initial penetrations to deeper advances and attempts to encircle larger formations. As the offensive entered its second week, the fighting around Zhitomir and Berdichev intensified and spread into a wider crisis for both sides. The initial Soviet penetrations, which had begun as narrow corridors through the German front, were extended in depth and width as additional armies entered the battle tank, and mechanized formations moved forward behind the infantry, turning local breakthroughs into broader wedges aimed at key road and rail junctions. German defensive belts that had been built up through November and early December were now attacked from multiple directions, complicating any attempt to restore a continuous line. On 28 December, Soviet formations captured Kazatin after several hours of contested fighting around the railway station and adjacent settlements. The loss of this junction affected German lateral movement and supply along the Fastov-Kazatin line. The next day, Korostan fell, reducing German control over the rail network north of Zhitomir. On 31 December, Soviet troops re-entered Zhitomir itself, which had changed hands several times since November. These advances, ranging from several dozen to more than 80 kilometers in some sectors, signaled that the offensive was no longer confined to the immediate Kiev bridgehead, but was reshaping the front across much of right-bank Ukraine. For 4th Panzer Army, the cumulative effect of these losses was a growing operational gap between its corps. Around Zhitomir, a distance of more than 50 kilometers opened between the southern flank of one corps and the positions of its neighbor, creating a zone in which Soviet units could move with relatively less resistance. Further south, another gap of approximately 100 kilometers developed between 4th Panzer Army and 1st Panzer Army. To fill these spaces, German command began transferring divisions from other sectors, including 12 divisions from the 1st Panzer Army's area in southern Ukraine. This redeployment temporarily strengthened threatened points, but thinned the front elsewhere and consumed much of Army Group South's mobile reserve. Within German headquarters, the situation produced a tension between operational assessments and political directives. Manstein and his staff argued that a controlled withdrawal to shorter lines would reduce the frontage, ease logistical burdens, and allow a more compact defense of western Ukraine. Reports to higher command stressed the risk that continued Soviet advances could cut the main routes connecting Army Group South to the Reich. However, Hitler viewed abandonment of additional Ukrainian territory as unacceptable. On December 27th, he refused Manstein's request to pull back, ordering the existing line to be held and further counterattacks to be prepared. On the Soviet side, the progress of the offensive posed its own set of problems. Rifle divisions that had led the initial assaults reported declining combat strength after days of continuous fighting and marches through winter terrain. To sustain the advance, Vatutin's headquarters committed additional formations and sought to rotate battered units out of the first echelon, where possible armoured and mechanized corps pressing toward Berdichev and Vinitsa experienced increasing mechanical losses and fuel consumption as they moved further from their initial supply depots near Kiev columns. Of trucks and horse-drawn wagons attempted to keep pace on damaged roads, while engineer units repaired bridges and cleared routes under winter conditions. By early January 1944, casualty figures underscored the scale of escalation. For the duration of the Zhitomir Berdichev operation, First Ukrainian Front recorded about 23,000 soldiers killed and 76,000 wounded or sick, and the loss of approximately 700 tanks and self-propelled guns. These totals, covering the period from 24th December to mid-January, meant an average of several thousand personnel casualties per day within a single Soviet front. German records for this specific operation are fragmentary, but post-war Soviet and Western studies agree that multiple German divisions were reduced to half strength or less, with 2 reserve infantry divisions later disbanded and several others withdrawn for rebuilding. For soldiers in the field, these numbers translated into visible changes within units. Soviet rifle companies that had started the offensive close to their authorized strength found themselves reduced to a few dozen men after repeated assaults and marches. German infantry battalions saw similar reductions after counterattacks and defensive actions, leading to frequent reorganization of companies and the consolidation of depleted units. In both armies, replacements often arrived directly from training depots with limited frontline experience, joining formations that had already undergone weeks of continuous engagement. The civilian environment around the expanding front reflected the escalation. Towns such as Kazatin, Korosten, and Zhitomir, important nodes in the regional transport system, were subjected to artillery fire, air attacks, and street fighting as control shifted. Railway workers, municipal staff, and remaining local officials were required to adapt rapidly to new authorities, first under withdrawal orders from German occupation structures, and then under Soviet military administrations, evacuations of German administrative personnel and certain categories of workers took place alongside the southward and westward movement of troops, further congesting roads and rail lines already used for reinforcement and supply. Internationally, the winter battles in Ukraine drew less attention than events in Italy or the air war over Germany, but Allied intelligence services monitored the progress of the Soviet offensive through radio intercepts, and aerial reconnaissance reports to London and Washington noted the depth of Soviet advances and the strain on German forces, interpreting the fighting west of Kiev as an indicator that Army Group South was being pushed back towards Central Europe. These assessments contributed to broader discussions about coordinating Allied operations in 1944, even though the details of the Zhitomir Berdichev battles remained largely confined to specialist briefings. By the time Berdichev itself was captured on January 5, 1944, the offensive had moved from its opening phase into a period characterized by extended front lines, high daily casualties, and increasing pressure on both command systems. For the Soviet side, the crisis took the form of sustaining momentum with forces that were rapidly expending men and equipment. For the German side, it appeared as the risk of losing operational coherence on the northern flank of Army Group South, despite repeated attempts at local counterattack and redeployment. The most intense phase of the Zhitomir Berdichev offensive unfolded in the first half of January 1944, when Soviet and German commands both committed their remaining reserves to decide whether the advance would crystallize into a deeper breakthrough or be contained along a new line. The capture of Berdichev and a series of rail junctions did not end the fighting. Instead, it reshaped it into a contest over communication arteries and the flanks of the expanding Soviet salient. Vatutin's headquarters ordered the front to continue its advance toward Vinnytsia and the southern Bug, while at the same time protecting its northern and southern flanks against possible counterblows. Tank and mechanized formations, including the 1st and 3rd Guards tank armies, were pushed forward to exploit the breach. Their tasks included seizing crossings over rivers such as the Gniloi Tikich and the southern Bug, cutting remaining German rail lines, and preventing the withdrawal of German units in an orderly fashion. To support these mobile thrusts, combined arms armies had to keep pace, widening the corridors through which armour moved and clearing bypassed strongpoints. For German 4th Panzer Army and adjacent elements of 1st Panzer Army, This period was defined by a series of counterattacks aimed at slowing or diverting the Soviet advance. Armoured groups, assembled from available Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, attempted to strike the flanks of Soviet spearheads, particularly where tank corps had advanced ahead of their supporting infantry. In several sectors, German formations launched coordinated attacks with 50 to 80 tanks and assault guns, supported by concentrated artillery fire and local air support, to regain key road junctions or delay the movement of Soviet armour. These actions sometimes regained limited ground or forced Soviet units onto the defensive for a few days. But they also consumed fuel and further reduced the strength of already depleted divisions. On the battlefield, the peak of the campaign was marked by dense concentrations of personnel and equipment along narrow axes. Soviet tank brigades, with their T-34s and lighter supporting vehicles, manoeuvred along frozen or partially thawed roads, often forming columns that stretched for many kilometres. Self-propelled gun regiments followed to provide direct fire support against field fortifications and anti-tank positions. Artillery groups massed dozens of guns per kilometre on chosen sectors, conducting short, high-density barrages before each major push. On the German side, remaining Panthers, Panzerpfeifers and self-propelled guns were concentrated into Kampfgruppen that shifted from one threatened sector to another, sometimes engaging Soviet armour at close range in villages or along forest edges where visibility was limited. Civilian suffering reached a peak in this period as well. Towns such as Berdichev, Kazatin and numerous smaller settlements lay astride main roads and railways and therefore became focal points of repeated attacks and counterattacks. Street fighting, artillery duels and airstrikes damaged housing, public buildings and industrial facilities. Civilians who had remained in these towns during the occupation now found themselves living among ruins, navigating streets blocked by wrecked vehicles and collapsed structures. Medical facilities were overwhelmed by both military and civilian wounded. In some localities, temporary aid stations were set up in schools, churches, or private homes, staffed by military medics and local nurses. The logistical burden of the peak fighting strained both systems. For First Ukrainian Front, each day of operations required the delivery of thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel and food over rail lines leading from the rear into newly captured hubs, then onward by truck or horse-drawn transport to frontline units. As the advance moved farther from Kiev, the length of supply routes increased, and the accumulation of destroyed bridges and damaged track complicated deliveries. Temporary depots were established in rail towns as soon as they were brought under Soviet control. Even while fighting continued on their outskirts, German forces, retreating under pressure, had to abandon or destroy stockpiles when withdrawal orders came too late, or when Soviet units approached more quickly than expected, leading to both shortages and the risk of captured supplies being used by the attackers. From the viewpoint of soldiers, this segment of the campaign often felt continuous, with limited opportunities for rest. Soviet riflemen might spend several days in assault, followed by a brief pause in hastily dug shelters, before being ordered forward again to clear another village or wood line. Tank crews faced long hours in freezing compartments, interspersed with sudden engagements at short range. German infantry engaged in delaying actions would occupy a trench or building, fight until ordered to pull back, then march through the night to a new defensive line, only to repeat the cycle. The cumulative fatigue affected reaction times, coordination, and the ability to maintain equipment. High command decisions during this period reflected the pressure of events. Vatutin and his staff had to choose where to concentrate their strongest formations, whether to prioritize the drive toward Vinnytsia and deeper into western Ukraine, or to reinforce flanks where German counterattacks threatened to cut off advanced corps. Orders frequently redirected tank armies from one axis to another, attempting to balance exploitation with security. At Army Group's South headquarters, Manstein sought permission for broader withdrawals to avoid encirclement and to establish a defensible line further west. The refusal of these proposals forced him to rely on successive local counterstrokes to keep withdrawal routes open, even as the overall line continued to bend and disintegrate in places. By mid-January, casualty returns and equipment reports indicated that both sides were approaching the limits of what they could sustain in this phase. Soviet armoured formations reported significant reductions in operational tanks. Many vehicles disabled by mechanical faults, mines or anti-tank fire. Rifle divisions counted losses that would require major replenishment before any further large-scale operations. German divisions, particularly infantry formations, had seen their combat strength drop to levels that made them vulnerable to renewed attacks and reduced their ability to hold extended fronts. This combination of operational gains and mounting losses signaled that the Zhitomir Berdichev offensive had reached its most intense stage, after which both sides would face the problem of consolidating positions or withdrawing under the pressure of exhausted forces. As the weeks passed, both sides adapted their methods to the conditions imposed by the winter fighting west of Kiev. For German formations, resistance increasingly took the form of flexible, improvised groupings rather than continuous linear defense divisions that had lost large parts of their infantry, reorganized around remaining battalions, anti-tank guns, and a core of armored vehicles, forming Kampfgruppen that could be shifted to threatened sectors. Commanders selected villages, river lines or road junctions as temporary strongpoints, fortifying stone buildings, clearing fields of fire, and preparing fallback positions a few kilometers to the rear. Instead of attempting to hold every segment of the original line, they aimed to delay and wear down Soviet units through a series of successive positions. Within the First Ukrainian Front, adaptation meant changing the balance between rapid advances and securing the ground already taken. As armoured spearheads moved ahead of the main body, Soviet command attached additional infantry and artillery to tank corps to reduce their vulnerability to flank counterattacks. Rifle divisions received orders to leave smaller screening detachments in secondary sectors and concentrate more of their strength along the main axes, allowing them to maintain pressure despite heavy losses. Artillery staffs reworked fire plans to emphasize short, concentrated barrages immediately before an assault, in order to save ammunition while still suppressing key German positions. In some sectors, Soviet forces shifted from mass daylight attacks to a combination of night assaults and infiltration tactics. Reconnaissance units and small assault groups explored gaps between German strongpoints, attempting to bypass fortified settlements and cut roads behind them, rather than capturing each point in frontal combat. Where this succeeded, German positions that had been prepared for direct assault found themselves threatened from the rear or deprived of supply routes, forcing withdrawal without prolonged engagements. In other places, terrain and weather made such maneuvers difficult, and commanders reverted to more traditional methods of attack. German adaptation relied heavily on mobility where resources allowed it. Tank and self-propelled gun units were kept in reserve behind sectors considered most likely to be attacked, ready to move by night to launch counterblows at first light. When Soviet armour broke through, these mobile groups aimed for the flanks, attempting to isolate forward elements from their supporting infantry. Even when they could not restore the original line, such counterattacks could force Soviet tank brigades to halt or assume defensive positions, buying time for further withdrawals. The cost of these actions was paid in fuel consumption and mechanical wear. Each movement over icy or muddy roads increased breakdowns in already depleted fleets. Partisan activity formed another layer of resistance and adaptation. In forests and rural districts of right-bank Ukraine, Soviet partisan detachments coordinated with front headquarters to disrupt German rear areas. They attacked small convoys, damaged rail tracks and targeted bridges, complicating the movement of reinforcements and supplies. German occupation authorities responded with increased security measures, escorting trains with additional guards, organizing anti-partisan sweeps and imposing reprisals in villages suspected of aiding irregular forces. This interplay further strained transport networks at the very moment when frontline units required rapid resupply and reinforcement. Civilian strategies for survival also evolved under the pressure of the campaign. Families that had experienced frontline passage earlier in the war drew on prior experience, preparing cellars as shelters, storing food in concealed pits, and devising ways to signal non-involvement to whichever military forces arrived. Some communities attempted to maintain local services, such as bakeries or small workshops, under both German and Soviet authorities, adjusting to changing demands. Others dispersed to nearby woods or relatives' homes away from main roads when fighting approached, returning only after the front had moved on. Adaptation did not guarantee safety, but it influenced how communities endured repeated changes in control. Within units, resource management became a daily form of adaptation. Soviet tank and artillery crews salvaged parts from damaged vehicles, using the remains of destroyed equipment to keep others operational. Field repair workshops worked under canvas in freezing temperatures, welding armor plates and replacing engines with limited tools. German maintenance units did the same, often under the additional constraint of retreat, which shortened the time available for repairs. Ammunition stocks were rationed according to priority sectors, with some battalions receiving enough for only a few short engagements each day. Commanders had to balance requests from subordinate units with the need to preserve reserves for future actions. Psychologically, both armies sought to sustain morale using familiar instruments adapted to the conditions at the front. Soviet political officers organized brief meetings in trenches and shelters, recounting recent successes and the liberation of specific towns to link individual hardship with broader progress. German officers emphasized the importance of holding open withdrawal routes and protecting the homeland, while chaplains and unit leaders conducted short services or gatherings when circumstances allowed. Letters from home, when they arrived, offered reminders of life beyond the front, but also carried news of air raids and shortages that underscored the stakes of the campaign. These forms of resistance and adaptation did not alter the overall direction of the winter fighting, which continued to move westward. They did, however, influence the tempo and character of operations on each sector of the front. The ability of small units to improvise defences, repair equipment, organize supply and maintain cohesion under pressure helped determine whether a given village, road or river line became a brief waypoint in the advance or a point of prolonged contest. The turning point of the Zhitomir Berdichev offensive emerged when the accumulation of local gains produced an irreversible change in the operational situation. By early January 1944, Soviet forces had pushed the German line back tens of kilometers, creating a salient that penetrated deeply into Army Group South's northern flank. Key junctions already captured now functioned as bases for further maneuver, allowing Soviet commands to redirect tank and mechanized formations toward the rear areas of several German corps rather than simply against their fronts. For the first time since autumn, German staff maps showed gaps that could no longer be closed with available reserves. A critical decision point came when German command recognized that counterattacks using remaining armored units could no longer restore the original positions around Zhitomir and Berdichev. Local counterblows still inflicted losses and sometimes regained individual villages or ridgelines, but they failed to re-establish a continuous defensive system. Each new attempt consumed fuel and vehicles that could not be replaced quickly. This forced Manstein and his subordinates to shift from the aim of holding specific towns to the more limited objective of preserving combat-capable corps of divisions for later operations further west. On the Soviet side, the turning point was perceived as the moment when the offensive no longer risked being halted by a concentrated German counterstroke. Reports from reconnaissance and intercepted radio traffic indicated that German formations were withdrawing in stages and that newly arrived units were being used mainly to cover retreats rather than to launch major attacks. Vatutin's headquarters concluded that the initiative in right bank Ukraine had passed decisively to First Ukrainian Front. Orders began to emphasize encirclement and disruption of withdrawal routes rather than frontal assaults on every prepared position. This shift was visible on the ground. Soviet armored groups increasingly aimed to cut highways and railways behind German units, forcing them onto secondary roads and improvised tracks. When a rail line or major road was severed, German divisions in the affected sector had to abandon heavy equipment or attempt cross-country movements in winter conditions, reducing their cohesion. In several cases, rearguards established at river crossings or road junctions were left to delay the Soviet advance, while main bodies moved toward the new lines further west. Once captured, these choke points provided further staging areas for Soviet artillery and supply columns. For civilians, the turning point took the form of a change in the pattern of movement and control. In districts that had already seen repeated shifts of occupation, the latest passage of front lines was followed not by renewed German counterattacks, but by the establishment of Soviet military administrations that remained in place. Local inhabitants observed that German units were now moving west with few attempts to return, often destroying infrastructure as they left. Soviet authorities began reorganizing local councils, reopening schools and workshops where possible, and initiating measures to identify collaboration and wartime crimes. The sense of a temporary frontline zone gave way to a perception, however cautious, that the German occupation in these areas had ended. At the operational level, the turning point also altered how both sides thought about the coming months. Soviet planners started to treat the results in the Zhitomir Berdichev sector as the first step in a sequence of operations that could push German forces back toward the pre-war Polish border and set conditions for encirclements further south. The weakening of 4th Panzer Army's northern wing opened possibilities for later offensives aimed at trapping German formations between converging fronts for German command. The same developments raised the prospect that Army Group South might be forced to abandon not only right bank Ukraine, but also much of its remaining depth of defense before the Carpathians. International observers, reading fragmentary reports and intelligence summaries, identified this phase as evidence that the Eastern Front was undergoing another qualitative change. The ability of the Red Army to conduct a large-scale winter offensive, maintain pressure through several weeks of fighting, and compel major German withdrawals suggested that earlier assumptions about seasonal pauses were no longer valid. For Allied planners, this meant that Soviet operations would likely tie down substantial German forces in the east during the period when preparations for Western European landings were reaching their final stages. For the participants, however, the turning point was experienced less as a single event and more as a gradual recognition that the direction of movement would not reverse. Soviet soldiers noted that newly liberated towns were not being retaken and that orders increasingly referred to further advances rather than holding newly gained ground. German troops became aware that each new defensive line lay further west and that withdrawals followed withdrawals, despite efforts at local resistance. In this sense, the Zhitomir Berdichev offensive marked a transition from a front characterized by repeated oscillations to one in which the retreat of Army Group South acquired a sustained westward momentum. By mid-January 1944, the tempo of operations in the Zhitomir Berdichev sector began to slow. Soviet advances, which had pushed the front westward by dozens of kilometers and brought major towns like Zhitomir, Kazatin and Berdichev under the First Ukrainian Front's control, now encountered lengthening supply lines and exhausted units. Orders from Vatutin's headquarters shifted emphasis from continuous forward movement to consolidating gains, restoring order in liberated areas, and preparing for subsequent operations further south and west. Rifle divisions were pulled back from the foremost positions where possible to be replenished. Tank and mechanized corps were withdrawn to short rest areas for repairs and reorganization. For Army Group South, the end of the Zhitomir Berdichev offensive took the form of a managed withdrawal under pressure. German corps fell back to new defensive lines further west, often along rivers or ridges selected in earlier planning as potential stop lines. Rear guards composed of infantry, engineers, and remaining armoured vehicles covered these movements, demolishing bridges, laying new minefields, and attempting to delay Soviet reconnaissance units. Not all withdrawals proceeded in an orderly fashion. In some sectors, Soviet breakthroughs or partisan activity disrupted road networks, forcing columns of vehicles, guns, and horse-drawn wagons to detour across open country or abandon heavy equipment. The cessation of large-scale fighting did not mean an immediate end to violence. Soviet troops advancing into recently vacated German positions encountered scattered pockets of resistance, small groups cut off from their parent units, and rearguard detachments that continued to hold villages or wood lines until their routes of escape were severed. Short engagements and skirmishes persisted as these groups attempted to break out or surrendered. At the same time, Soviet security units and counterintelligence organs began operating in the rear of First Ukrainian Front, screening newly liberated areas for remaining German agents, local auxiliary forces, and individuals suspected of collaboration. Civilian life in the affected regions entered a new phase shaped by the aftermath of occupation and battle. Towns such as Zhitomir and Berdichev bore traces of both long-term German rule and the most recent fighting. Damaged rail yards, burned warehouses, destroyed residential districts and infrastructure. Local administrations were reconstituted under Soviet authority, often incorporating individuals who had spent the occupation in concealment or in forced labour registration of the population. Food rationing systems and the reopening of basic services became immediate tasks. At the same time, investigations into wartime crimes, including the destruction of Jewish communities and the repression of forced labourers and partisans, began through commissions that collected testimony and documented mass graves. Refugees and displaced persons moved in multiple directions. Some inhabitants who had fled approaching front lines returned to towns and villages to find their homes damaged or occupied. Others departed westward with retreating German columns, either voluntarily or under compulsion, fearing reprisals or conscription. The presence of Soviet military traffic on main roads limited civilian mobility. So many families resettled temporarily in nearby rural areas until transport conditions permitted longer journeys. Fields and workshops, where not destroyed, resumed work under severe shortages of tools, livestock and seed. First Ukrainian Front compiled final summaries of the operation, recording personnel and equipment casualties and noting units that had distinguished themselves in breaching the German line and capturing key objectives. Some formations received honorific titles associated with liberated towns. Others were reclassified or merged to reflect reduced strength. German commands undertook similar accounting, noting divisions so depleted that they had to be dissolved or transferred out of the front line for rebuilding, and identifying those that would form the core of new defensive groupings further west. Medical services on both sides were heavily occupied with the aftermath. Soviet field hospitals that had followed the advance now treated large numbers of wounded collected from forward aid posts and battlefield dressing stations, alongside civilians injured during the fighting. German medical units, retreating with their formations, evacuated wounded as far as railheads still in their control, but many lightly wounded soldiers remained with their units to maintain numbers. Diseases associated with winter campaigning, frostbite, respiratory infections, intestinal illnesses, appeared alongside trauma injuries, reflecting the combined effects of climate and combat. By the time the front stabilized along a new line to the west of the cities taken in the operation, preparations were already underway for the next phase of the broader Dnieper-Carpathian campaign. For Soviet command, the Zhitomir Berdichev offensive had opened the way to further operations aimed at encircling German forces in central Ukraine. For German planners, the newly established positions were understood as temporary, to be held as long as possible while reserves were sought and new plans drafted. The immediate aftermath thus contained both an end, a pause in the intense fighting around Zhitomir and Berdichev, and a transition towards subsequent engagements that would extend the pattern of advance and withdrawal deeper into western Ukraine. In the longer view of the war, the Zhitomir Berdichev offensive became both a component of a larger strategic shift and an episode that received less distinct attention than its scale might suggest. Militarily, it formed part of the Dnieper-Carpathian campaign that pushed Army Group South out of much of right-bank Ukraine and set the conditions for later encirclements, including the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky operation and the Uman-Botosani and Proskurov-Chernovtsi offensives. The winter battles west of Kiev weakened German 4th Panzer Army and disrupted the northern wing of Army Group South, contributing to the loss of operational freedom that would become evident during the summer campaigns of 1944. From the Soviet perspective, the operation had clear strategic significance, but an ambiguous place in memory. Official wartime and post-war narratives emphasize the liberation of Kiev and the winter campaign of 1943 to 1944 as a whole, rather than highlighting Zhitomir and Berdichev as separate battles. Later emphasis shifted toward the summer offensives of 1944, Operation Bagration in Belarus, and the Lvov-Sandomierz offensive in western Ukraine and Poland, which produced large encirclements and easily presented successes. The winter fighting west of Kiev, by contrast, involved high losses, complex maneuver, and no single decisive encirclement that could be used as a clear symbol. Casualty statistics underline this complexity. For First Ukrainian Front, the operation between late December 1943 and mid-January 1944 cost on the order of 100,000 personnel casualties in killed, wounded and sick, along with the loss or disabling of hundreds of tanks and self-propelled guns. German formations in the sector suffered heavy attrition as well. Several divisions were reduced to a fraction of their authorized strength. Some were later disbanded or rebuilt, and overall losses for Army Group South in the Dnieper-Carpathian campaign reached into the hundreds of thousands when including killed, wounded, and missing. These numbers placed the winter fighting on a scale comparable to more famous operations, but without the same concentration of events into a single named battle. For German post-war memory and historiography, Zhitomir and Berdichev appeared mainly as elements in broader narratives of retreat from Ukraine and disputes between front commanders and Hitler memoirs by senior officers emphasized operational disagreements, shortages of reserves and fuel, and the impossibility of holding extended fronts, often using the winter of 1943 to 1944 as an example of the consequences of rigid directives from higher command. At the tactical and divisional level, veterans' accounts recorded the conditions of winter withdrawal and local counterattacks without necessarily treating the offensive as a distinct campaign. Civilian memory in right-bank Ukraine followed a different pattern. For local communities, the winter of 1943 to 1944 marked the end of German occupation and the transition to Soviet rule, accompanied by the visible traces of battle. Destroyed infrastructure, mass graves, and the absence of those who had been killed, deported, or had left with retreating forces. Commemorative practices developed around liberation dates of specific towns, memorials to Soviet soldiers, and later, investigations into wartime crimes against civilians, especially Jewish communities. In these local frameworks, the names Zhitomir, Berdichev, Kazatin, and others retained significance independent of their prominence in wider military historiography. During the Cold War, international coverage of the Eastern Front tended to focus on operations that were easier to present as turning points. Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, and the encirclements of 1944. The Zhitomir Berdichev offensive, embedded within the larger Dnieper-Carpathian campaign, appeared mainly in specialized studies dealing with operational detail. Only with the opening of archives and the work of later historians did more precise figures and assessments of the winter fighting west of Kiev enter broader scholarship, highlighting the extent of casualties and the continuity between the 1943 and 1944 campaigns. In contemporary discussions, the operation is increasingly examined as part of the cumulative process by which the Red Army transformed local successes into a sustained westward movement. It illustrates how winter operations, once considered difficult and limited in scope, became major instruments of Soviet strategy, and how the weakening of German forces in one sector influenced outcomes months later in others. At the same time, the high human cost relative to the absence of a single, iconic battle narrative helps explain why the Zhitomir Berdichev offensive has often been overshadowed in public memory by summer victories, even as its consequences shape the subsequent course of the war in Ukraine and Central Europe.